Wow, Sarah, you're up early. I called out to my granddaughter Sarah, who was unusually sitting up in bed. Today, Sarah's mother had to leave suddenly for a business trip, and her father had dashed off, saying he had golf. It's nice weather today, so maybe it's a good idea to go to the park a little further away than usual. However, when I spoke, Sarah turned to look at me, her small eyebrows furrowed. "Grandma, is it okay for adults to lie?" she asked, tilting her head. Taken aback by the sudden question, I must have looked confused, but then I remembered scolding Sarah for lying yesterday. Assuming it was a continuation of that conversation. "Of course not," I answered. But Sarah seemed unsatisfied with that answer. "But, Mom said..." At the sudden mention of another person, I was puzzled. But then, as if presenting evidence, Sarah showed me a recording on her mobile phone, and my expression changed. "See? I'm Jessica, a 64-year-old part-time worker at a supermarket. I've lived an ordinary life since I was young, and at 22, I married a man named Michael through an introduction by my parents. I wasn't positive about the marriage at first, but it brightened up my life. Michael, who was much older, always respected and adored me. He would always ask what I wanted to eat, where I wanted to go, and encouraged me when I struggled with unfamiliar household chores. At that time, there was a strong expectation that women should perfectly manage all household tasks, but Michael never said such a thing. He would always pat my head when I made mistakes, saying, "It's okay." He even took to the kitchen willingly. I had strongly thought that I was compromising with this marriage, but it was only a matter of time before I was genuinely attracted to Michael. Eventually, we became a famously close couple in the neighborhood. It was a very fulfilling marriage, but there was one thing that troubled me. We couldn't seem to have children. Michael liked children and always adored the little ones in the neighborhood. So, I wanted to give him his own child and, more than anything, wanted to expand our family. But the miracle we hoped for did not come easily. After 5 years, overwhelmed by physical discomfort, I rushed to the hospital and heard something completely unexpected. "Congratulations, you're pregnant." Michael was overjoyed. After spinning me around in happiness, he suddenly turned pale, exclaiming, "What have I done to your precious body?" Watching him, I laughed and felt the happiest moment of my life. But the seat of the happiest moment was soon taken by another event. After 10 months, the life that had lived with me finally came into our arms. Michael and I cried tears of joy together. We named our precious child Richard. Richard was born smaller than average, but grew up healthy. Every word and action of Richard's was a source of joy and concern for both Michael and me. I believed those blissful days would continue forever. I remember that day clearly. The rare phone call that came to the house. Michael's colleague's panicked voice, and then the harsh reality that he would never return to us. Even 2 months after his funeral, I was still in a daze. It was an accident at work. So sudden, so abrupt. That's why I kept feeling like he would come back any moment, and stood at the entrance holding Richard. But it wasn't Michael who came. A man from his workplace came to visit, leaving some condolence money in my hands before swiftly leaving. Such things could never replace his presence. The moment I thought that, the reality that he was gone hit me hard. I found myself crying out loud, face down on the floor. What brought me back to reality from my despair was Richard. Sitting on the cold floor, huddled up, Richard looked at me and placed his small hand on my head. The warmth from his touch stopped my tears. It was always Michael who comforted me this way, placing his hand on my head whenever I cried. I always felt protected by his large hands. But he was no longer here. I could no longer afford to be weak. I had to become the protector, the comforter for someone much more vulnerable and smaller than myself. Holding Richard, I let out what I decided would be my last tears in life. From then on, my days were filled with juggling work and raising Richard. Time flew by frighteningly fast. Richard, who had grown both in mind and body in the blink of an eye, became independent when he went to college and moved out for a job. Even though it was just the next state over, a mere 30-minute drive if you had a car, I couldn't help but feel lonely and worried. But he's Michael's son, he'll be fine. Telling myself that, I watched over him without interfering much. Eventually, Richard surpassed the age at which we had him. He seems to be doing well at work. While working part-time at a local supermarket for living expenses, I eagerly await any news from my son. One day, I received a call from Richard. He said he wanted to come home soon because there was someone he wanted to introduce to me. We set a date for the near future, and after hanging up, I muttered, "Finally, my child has." That day, I visited Michael's grave to report the news. Then, on the next Saturday, when Richard was supposed to come home, I waited in the living room with an uneasy feeling. I rushed to the door while smoothing my hair at the sound of the doorbell. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door to find Richard with a slightly nervous expression and an unfamiliar woman. "I'm home," Richard said in a brusque tone, while the woman, with her mouth tightly shut, didn't say a word as she looked at me. I couldn't help but be a little concerned about her attitude, but welcomed them into the living room anyway. I served coffee along with some snacks I had prepared. As I took my seat, Richard immediately began introducing the woman sitting next to him. "Mom, this is Dorothy. I'm planning to marry her." I smiled at Dorothy, introducing myself. There was no smile or word from Dorothy in return. Richard and Dorothy had met through an acquaintance, and it turns out Dorothy was 6 years younger than him. I was surprised to hear she was still a college student. From a societal perspective, it might be considered a marriage with an age difference, but having been significantly younger than Michael myself, it didn't bother me. While I had some concerns about Dorothy, marriage is foremost about respecting each other's feelings. With that thought, I offered my blessings with a smile. Richard and Dorothy got married shortly thereafter. A few days later, I was startled by the fact Richard awkwardly revealed over the phone after I casually mentioned. "So, no wedding party then?" "Actually, Dorothy's pregnant. Considering that, we really don't have the money." I was shocked to learn that Dorothy had already been pregnant on the day they came to greet me. More so, they had decided to marry in a hurry after discovering her pregnancy, and to visit me. Furthermore, Richard said, "With the baby coming, our current income just won't cut it. We'll have to move. So, I was wondering, could we possibly live with you, Mom?" And proposed. I've always made it a principle in my upbringing to respect my son's decisions and the consequences they bring. However, the complete lack of planning on their part gives me a headache. "But I don't have the means either. And is Dorothy okay with this?" "Dorothy wants to do this as well." I couldn't help but let out a big sigh. Considering the well-being of my unborn grandchild, perhaps it's better to accept their proposal. But truly, I don't have much leeway either. Even though I work, it's just a part-time job, and I'm not exactly swimming in money or time. Besides, the house Michael bought, while reasonably spacious, was originally meant for 3 people. If Richard and his wife and child were to live here, Michael's study, which has been carefully maintained for decades, would inevitably have to go. Even though it seemed selfish, I felt strong resistance to losing the study I cherished. In the end, I put off giving an answer and hung up the phone. But I immediately regretted not expressing my opinion clearly. A few months after their marriage, around the time Dorothy was about to enter the 10th month of pregnancy, Unexpectedly, our doorbell rang when no deliveries were scheduled. Confused, I answered the door only to be astounded beyond words. There stood a moving company worker, smiling. The young man, removing his hat to greet me, stood in front of a large truck. Having had no plans for a move, I questioned what this was about. He repeatedly checked his device, puzzled, saying it was Richard's request and that this house was specified as their new home. I was speechless, experiencing shock for the second time that day. Regaining my composure, I apologized to the mover and urgently called Richard. After a few rings, Richard answered. "Oh, did the stuff arrive? I'm on my way there now." As if it were a fact. "I wasn't informed. And I haven't agreed to you living in our house." I found myself yelling over the phone, to which Richard sounded apologetic. "But Dorothy wanted to move in while she was in the hospital. She thought you'd be happy you could live with your grandchild." I was speechless at the audacity. It turned out, the previous residence was already cancelled and vacated. As much as I couldn't forgive this action, I couldn't turn away my son and his family, about to welcome a baby. Thus, I reluctantly agreed to live together. Soon after, Dorothy, having given birth, moved in, and our household of 4 began. The baby was born without any issues. Her name is Sarah. Holding my finger in her small hand, I am moved by affection. There's no blame on Sarah, and if this child grows up healthy and happy, perhaps there's meaning in giving up the cherished study. With that thought, I stood up to tidy up the kitchen. Since the start of our cohabitation, all household chores, cooking, laundry, cleaning, have fallen to me. Early on, I have to take care of the baby and work part-time. If I did housework too, I'd collapse. "Jessica, you'll handle the chores, right?" Dorothy declared, and since then, I've reluctantly accepted it. Not just Dorothy, but Richard too, took it for granted to leave all household tasks to me. With one adult becoming 3, the workload more than doubled, and items like baby bottles require extra care. While tirelessly managing everything for Sarah's well-being, I held back my sighs. 3 years later, Dorothy announced at dinner that she finally got a job. "I was able to get a job at a trading company through a friend from college. Please let me stay with you until I get used to the job." Without showing any sign of apology, Dorothy said this to me, and I replied with resignation. But that wasn't the only thing she wanted. "And since I'll be working, I'd like you to take care of Sarah during my work hours." I raised my eyebrows at that and objected. "I have a job too. If we're both working, we can use a childcare center. Why pay for childcare when it's just a part-time job? You could look after her for free. And it's such a hassle to find one." I glanced at Richard, who simply said, "Sorry," and looked away. It seemed Dorothy really intended to leave Sarah and go to work, with no intention of looking for a childcare center. Richard's attitude was as if it wasn't his concern. I couldn't just leave 3-year-old Sarah alone, so I negotiated with my employer to somehow change my shifts. Fortunately, they were understanding and adjusted my shifts so I could arrange the environment before Dorothy started her job. Sarah, who didn't mind spending long hours with me, was actually quite happy. Her curiosity made every activity sparkle her eyes, a delightful granddaughter. Initially, we spent the days making snacks and taking naps. But worrying about the lack of interaction with peers since we weren't going to a childcare center, I started taking her to the park and for walks more actively. Sarah, who was shy at first and hid behind me, eventually joined in and played happily with other children in the park. I watched this fondly. This routine continued for about 4 years, until Sarah started elementary school. There were several arguments with Richard and Dorothy, but their attitude didn't change. Even after Sarah started school, returning to my old life wasn't immediate, and I continued to work shorter shifts to be there when Sarah came home. One day, I waited for Sarah to return at the front door. She came back, swinging her hat joyfully, and screamed immediately after opening the door when she saw me standing there. I said sternly, "Sarah, you haven't given Grandma the important notice from your teacher, have you?" Sarah's eyes widened as if she remembered. But then she looked away and clumsily lied. "I don't know. There wasn't any." Of course, I already knew since the teacher had called me directly. I grabbed Sarah's shoulders with both hands and scolded her. "Lying is wrong. You could lose friends that way." Sarah's eyes teared up, and she apologized in a small voice. Scolding or indulging Sarah was clearly my role. As Richard and Dorothy had left all aspects of parenting to me over these 4 years. I patted Sarah's head after she apologized quickly, and told her, "I've prepared a snack, so go wash your hands." Sarah ran off towards her room with a relieved face. Watching her back, I thought about whether I should encourage more interaction between her and her parents, since it wasn't good for Sarah or them in the long run. Tomorrow was a day off, after all. But my plan was immediately shattered. "I'll be going on a business trip with a colleague starting tomorrow, so I'm counting on you to take care of Sarah," Dorothy announced at dinner. Richard seemed surprised too, as if this was news to him. "Tomorrow is a Saturday. And is a business trip decided that quickly?" I asked Dorothy incredulously. I couldn't work much during the week and had my shifts on the weekend. Suddenly being told this, I couldn't manage. However, Dorothy snorted as if mocking me. "Don't act like you know. I work properly at a trading company, so of course this happens. But I have work tomorrow, and the day after too," I said, looking at Richard, who avoided my gaze. Frowning, Richard mumbled, "I have golf tomorrow. Can't cancel." I felt the same way. I couldn't cancel either. However, I noticed Sarah looking anxious beside me. I bit my almost open lips, sighed, and closed my eyes. Thus, I ended up taking the next day off work. The next morning, Dorothy left the house early, seeming uplifted. Richard also left early, as if fleeing. When I went to wake Sarah, she was unusually already awake. "Good morning, Sarah. You're up early today," I said, and Sarah, who was sitting on the bed with her back to me, turned around. After I stroked her messy hair, Sarah spoke. "Hey, Grandma. Is it okay for adults to lie unlike children?" "Huh? What's up all of a sudden?" Surprised, I remembered scolding her for lying the day before and wondered if this was a continuation. While puzzled by her train of thought, I answered Sarah's question. Of course, adults shouldn't lie either. However, Sarah looked dissatisfied with the answer. "But, Mom..." I was puzzled by her sudden mention of Dorothy. Sarah, looking frustrated with me, said, "Listen to this," and handed me her mobile phone. Sarah, who often had to stay home alone due to my work schedule, had been given a child-friendly mobile phone at the time of her enrollment. It only allows limited app usage, but I was impressed by how well Sarah could use it without being taught. The mobile phone she handed me displayed the recording app's playback screen. Seeing it made me frown. "You promised Grandma not to secretly listen to people's conversations using this." Yes, Sarah had been scolded by me for placing her mobile phone in my room with the recording app activated, which I had found. She seemed to have wanted to imitate a detective from a popular comic, and had cried while promising never to do it again. But Sarah, on the verge of tears, exclaimed, But, Mom is always talking to someone at night, and I thought it might be a ghost, so I had to become a detective." I tilted my head at her words. Richard and Dorothy's bedrooms are separate, and Dorothy uses what was originally a study on her own. Dorothy refuses even Richard entering her room, which makes it unlikely she talks to him every night. Sensing my anger drifting away, Sarah quickly pressed the playback button. I tried to stop her in a panic, but the voice that came out made me freeze. "I'm so excited about our overnight date tomorrow." "Huh? We're lying to our husbands that it's just a business trip. We're not naughty. It's okay because we're adults." The voice coming from the mobile phone was unmistakably Dorothy's. But its content was unbelievable. Stunned, Sarah spoke to me. "See, Mom says it's okay for adults to lie." Sarah, still young, hardly understood the conversation, picking up only that part. I instinctively hugged Sarah and took a deep breath. Then, trying to keep my voice from shaking, I told her breakfast was ready and to go to the living room. When I told her we're having French toast today, Sarah threw her mobile phone and happily ran off. After she was out of sight, I took out my own mobile phone from my pocket. Time passed, and it was Sunday night. "I'm home." Dorothy came back in a good mood after Sarah had already gone to bed. Richard's face tensed as he drank coffee in the living room. I hid in the shadows of the kitchen, out of view from the living room. Dorothy, unaware, peered into the living room, saw us, and headed towards her room. However, Richard called her name, stopping her. "Dorothy, come here, please." Dorothy, looking puzzled, obediently sat at the dining table. "What is it?" "I'm tired from the business trip." Richard's face hardened at those words. He began gravely. "You're having an affair, aren't you?" On Saturday morning, after listening to the conversation recorded on Sarah's mobile phone, I immediately contacted Richard. He listened to the recording as soon as he got back. "What are you talking about?" Dorothy responded nonchalantly. She seemed intent on playing ignorant. To that, Richard pulled something out of his pocket. Dorothy, wary, followed it with her eyes. What Richard took out was Sarah's mobile phone. Noticing it, Dorothy seemed to let her guard down a bit, showing a slight relief. However, her complexion changed the moment Richard operated the mobile phone and pressed the playback button. "I really love you. My husband has been so unbearable lately." "What is this?" Dorothy tried to snatch the mobile phone from Richard's hand, but was avoided. The mobile phone continued to play unbearable content. The voice of a man, presumably the person on the phone, could be heard occasionally, indicating Sarah's mobile phone was close by. Unable to take the mobile phone, Dorothy, her face turning red, began to tremble. Then she shouted loudly, "Yes, I was cheating! What's wrong with that? Let me have a little fun! I'm at the end of my 20s, after all." I was speechless at her unexpected admission. Richard seemed the same, silent for a moment, but then stood up from his chair, resolved to face Dorothy. "Dorothy, we're getting a divorce." "Huh? I won't accept that." Dorothy, not understanding her position, complained to Richard. That's when I came out of the kitchen and confronted her, shocked, with the mobile phone. "I've got your admission of cheating recorded right here." With both me and Richard glaring at her, Dorothy weakly sat down in the chair. Then, I also sat down, and a discussion ensued. Richard demanded a divorce, custody, and compensation from Dorothy. And I also told her to leave this house. Dorothy screamed something, but when Richard mentioned he had already consulted a lawyer, she paled and looked down. The next day, formal negotiations seemed to have taken place with a lawyer present. I heard that Dorothy, who had been resistant until the end, eventually agreed to all demands. Since Richard and I refused to live with Dorothy in the same house any longer, Dorothy left the house with minimal belongings. I told Sarah, who looked confused as she watched, that she might not see her mother as often anymore. Sarah, looking anxious, furrowed her brows and clung to my clothes, asking, "Can I still see you, Grandma?" I hugged Sarah and nodded deeply. "Of course. I'll always be here in this house." "Then it's okay." My heart ached at Sarah's words. I didn't want to make Sarah sad, but seeing her not cry over not being able to see her mother made me feel the thinness of their bond, which was sad. And then, I had a serious talk with Richard. I scolded him for always being submissive to Dorothy and not properly engaging with Sarah, and told him that if things remained the same, he should leave too. Richard, with a grim face, said, "I understand. I really reflected on this matter. I've been neglecting to think for myself all this time." He apologized for leaving everything up to me until now. And then he begged, "Once I can support Sarah on my own, I'll definitely leave. Can we live together as three for a little while longer?" I believed Richard's words and accepted them. Dorothy, having been kicked out of our house, ran to her lover's place only to encounter his wife. Turns out, her lover was also married. Naturally, his wife was furious and called her husband, who was still at work. Because she revealed everything to a colleague of her husband who tried to take the call, the affair between Dorothy and her lover spread through the company in an instant. After receiving disciplinary action from their company, it was discovered that they had taken unnecessary business trips for their rendezvous multiple times. As a result, Dorothy and her lover were effectively fired and had no choice but to leave the company. After such a debacle, it was unsurprising that the two quickly parted ways. However, breaking up did not exempt Dorothy from her responsibilities, and she had to pay compensation to Richard in addition to alimony demanded by her lover's wife. Having left her previous job for such reasons, she found it difficult to secure new employment and is now said to be working in the nightlife industry. Richard, who shared this story with me, struggles daily with household chores and childcare. Thanks to Richard's efforts in research and procedures, Sarah was able to enter preschool, allowing me almost to return to my original work situation. Although Richard, who had not been properly involved until now, faces rejection from Sarah in many instances, it seems they are awkwardly building a new relationship. How about we go to this amusement park together next time? Well, okay. While they looked over a pamphlet for an amusement park in the next state, I watched them with a smile and sipped my coffee.
My name is Amy Snyder, and I'm 27 years old. I live with my dad and my mom. We've always lived together as a family of three. Ever since I was little, I've always looked up to my dad. He runs his own business, and it's always so busy. He's rarely home, but whenever he finds some spare time, he always comes back to see me. On his days off, he would spend most of his time with me. He's a great dad. My mom, on the other hand, is a different story altogether. As far as I can remember, I've never seen my mom work a day in her life. She takes care of things around the house, but she's never supported my dad's business, nor has she ever held a job outside the house. Sure, I knew we were well off, seeing as my mom spent most of her time dolled up and going out. But seeing her always on the go, I knew deep down I never wanted to turn out like her. She's never been fond of kids, and she hardly ever paid me any attention. There were times when I felt terribly lonely, but my dad was always there to fill that void. I think my dad knew how indifferent my mom was towards me. He made it his mission to never let me feel left out or alone. At least, that's what I believe. I'm home, Mom! Oh, is it that late already? Mom's going out, so eat some snacks and look after the house, okay? Didn't we promise to go shopping together today and make curry? Sorry. Something came up suddenly. We'll do that next time, okay? Okay. As a child, my mother broke promises like these with ease, no matter how many times we made them. At first, such things often brought me to tears, but as a child, I had to learn not to take promises with my mother as real promises. My father, on the other hand, was someone who would never make vague promises like, maybe, if I can, or I'll see. Over time, I came to love my father, or rather, to see him as a reliable and trustworthy person. That's how I started to think. I admired him and even begged to join his company after graduating from university. Of course, being an only child, I started thinking that I wanted to inherit the company someday and carry on the will of my father, whom I admired. After I turned 20, my father started taking me out for drinks, and I learned a lot from him. My mother was shallowly involved in raising me as I became an adult. The only time my mother intervened in my affairs was during my sophomore year of college. Dad, I want to work at your company after I graduate from school. I've already started studying for it. I even want to succeed you someday. Amy, are you sure? Wait a minute. A girl doesn't need to do that. Why not? I want to be someone who can work hard like Dad. A woman should find a good man and let her husband earn a good living. That was such a typical thing for my mother to say. I didn't think this person could understand anything I said. So, I didn't continue the conversation that day. I didn't want to live a life hanging on someone else's life like my mother. I had always strived to become a strong woman who would live on her own. For the rest of my college days, after that day, I studied hard. And I joined my father's company as soon as I graduated. I couldn't persuade my mother, but it seemed like she finally gave up in the end. If you want to live your life this way, that's fine with me, but you'll be the one who will have to suffer for not listening to your mother. If you are okay with that, then do as you please, she said. So I did as she told me. By joining my father's company in this way, the distance between my mother and me grew even deeper. On the other hand, I started spending more time with my father than before, and our bond got even stronger. Looking back now, I guess my mother wasn't too happy with this situation. When I joined my father's company, he put in a lot of effort to train me seriously. But there was a reason for that. My father was sick. It took him about half a year to introduce me to a lot of people and teach me about the job. And then, my father collapsed at our workplace. He was immediately taken to the hospital by ambulance. And for the next 5 years, he lived a life fighting his disease. Amy, how's the company doing? Is it running smoothly without your dad? It's really hard right now, but everyone is supporting me. I'm sure it will be fine because Dad trusted me with everything I need. Well, as long as that's the case, if you, a woman, take over as the second generation and cause the company to go bankrupt, it would be a real shame, so be prepared for that. Mom, you really don't have any interest or love for the company. You're only concerned about others' judgment. It's sad to hear you say that. When my father first collapsed, I often argued with my mom like this. My father would come to the company on his good days while going in and out of the hospital, gradually weakening over 5 years, and for the last year, he was almost bedridden. During the time when my father was still able to move, the last time he visited the company, he said this: "This company and its employees are very precious treasures to me, but I have to let go of my treasure. Dad, over the past few years, I've watched you work, Amy, and I think I can trust you with it. Can I ask you, please, protect this place. Protect everyone here, for me. I don't know if I can be like you, Dad, but I'll keep trying to get closer to you, who I've always admired, so you can rest easy." From that day on, the title of representative was passed on to me. I had been so busy that I barely had time to go home. Since my father was mostly in the hospital, I made time to go see him frequently. My mother did the bare minimum, like bringing him changes of clothes, but as far as I could see, she even seemed to find that bothersome. What does my mother think of my father? Does she not have any feelings or gratitude for him? Or any feelings of pity for a sick person? I couldn't help but feel sorry for my father. I recalled how hard he had worked for me when I was young. A child unable to feel my mother's love. No matter how exhausted I was, I made it a point to visit him as much as possible. This routine lasted for about a year until he passed away peacefully in his sleep. I was so swamped with various tasks that I barely had time to grieve. My mother, who knew nothing, insisted that I handle everything, from the funeral arrangements to the hospital paperwork. Realistically, I didn't expect my mother, who had never done anything but stay home and play, to handle all of these procedures. So, I silently took care of everything. Amy, the funeral's over. You've settled down now, haven't you? My mother broached the subject the day after the funeral. Please, leave this house. I've just inherited 200 million yen, so I have no use for you anymore. Thank you. I was waiting for you to say that. I had concluded that talking to her any further was pointless. Did she think it was okay to just have money and live a life of leisure? I had nothing but questions, but I decided to leave. The next day, I called the service and sold all my belongings related to me. My mother was utterly surprised at how quickly I had organized my departure. However, I had kept a secret from her. I didn't know why she claimed to have inherited 200 million yen, but my father had entrusted all the money matters to me, and I was the rightful inheritor. There wasn't a single penny left for my mother. My father had firmly requested this when he was still healthy. Your mother doesn't understand anything about money management or spending. I want you to give her household expenses on a monthly basis. If she gets a large sum, she'll likely go bankrupt immediately. But I don't think she'll listen to me. If she complains, tell her you won't give her a single penny. No way. Just kidding. But if you have trouble dealing with her, give her this. My father handed me an SD card. He said it contained a video letter from him to my mother. I never imagined that I would show her this, but judging from her recent attitude, I thought the day would come soon. My mother, alone in the spacious house after I left. I was expecting her to contact me soon, but she did so faster than I anticipated. Come home, immediately. Huh? What are you talking about? I'm working. I just need to talk to you. Please, come quickly. She's so self-centered. With that thought, I headed to my childhood home with the SD card. As soon as my mother saw me, she started accusing me. You ran off with all of your father's inheritance, didn't you? I knew something was off since you left right away. Hand over your father's inheritance to me, now. How greedy can you be? You can't even act right as a mother. Who do you think you're talking to? I quietly handed her the SD card. What's this? Oh, I guess you don't even know how to watch this. Mocking her, I took out my laptop, inserted the SD card, and played the video. On the screen was my father, as healthy as he used to be. I wonder how my mother will react to this video letter. I left the room in silence. I had never seen my mother defy my father before. But how about now? After his death? Would my father's thoughts reach my mother? When I returned to the room, my mother, who had finished watching everything, was crying. I couldn't believe it. My mother was crying while watching a video of my deceased father. I was curious about the video my father left for my mother, but I didn't dare to watch it myself. So I had no idea why my mother was crying. Mom, are you okay? Yes, for now. I get it. I will follow your father's instructions and leave everything to you from now on. Please go home for today. Call me again when you've cooled down. I thought she probably didn't want me to see her in a vulnerable state, so I went home right away that day. How did my father silence my mother? I was full of questions. Almost a month went by without hearing from my mother. I started to worry and decided to visit my parents' house during my lunch break, but my mother wasn't home. That night, I went to see my mother again. The lights were on at the house, which relieved me. I'm sorry for dropping in suddenly. I came by this afternoon, but you weren't home, so I got worried. I'm sorry. I was out for my part-time job during the day. What? A part-time job? My mother, as far as I knew, was a person who would absolutely not work. Why did it come to this? Didn't you watch that video? That was a video letter addressed to you, so I didn't watch it. You can take it home. You should watch it too, Amy. Can I watch it? My mother handed over the SD card to me, saying, well then. I felt a bit frightened to learn what my father conveyed, observing my mother's unusual demeanor. I went back to the office and sat down at the desk my father used. Then, I played the video. Honey, if you're watching this, it means you've not been able to communicate with Amy. First of all, thank you so much for helping me raise Amy until now. Without you, I don't think I could have managed the company while bringing up Amy. I felt something was off about the way my father was speaking. The next moment, my father said something shocking. You've taken care of Amy, even though she's not your child, and I have nothing but gratitude for you, who stood by my side for so many years. But, as a result, you've given up on your dreams and have reached your age without earning your own living, for which I take responsibility because I have allowed you to live a life of luxury. I'm sure you'll be in trouble when I'm gone. I'm not my mother's child? I was so surprised that I blurted it out. But then it made sense. Even though I didn't feel much love, she had been taking care of me by cooking for me every day and doing the bare minimum for a child who wasn't her own. Who is that person? I didn't register our marriage because you told me you felt bad for your sister, so I ended up supporting your living and didn't do anything else. I'm sorry. But once I'm gone, I worry about the rest of your life. There's no one to support you, and I've taken your life away. I couldn't believe what my father, who spoke so fluently, was saying. It was all news to me. My father kept talking about what had happened in the past and what he hopes for our future. I spent the whole night processing all this and went back to my mother the next day. Mom, I watched the video from Dad yesterday. You know it all now. I raised you because I was asked to. That's all. What happened to my biological mother? You are the child of my sister and your father. My sister died right after giving birth to you, and I told your distressed father that I would help raise Amy. I would become your mother. After hearing the story from my mother, I understood everything, even the parts I had imagined. My mother used to work in a diner, and my father used to go there to eat sometimes. My mother was lively and hardworking at that time, and her dream was to have her own diner. However, when she decided to become my mother, she gave up on that dream. After being reminded about her dream from my father, my mother decided to work for it again, and is now training as a part-timer to make that dream come true. I should have done this earlier. Working is fun and suits me. I had no idea. So, it's my fault you didn't work. I'm really sorry for not knowing anything. It's not your fault, Amy. I made the decision myself. But I'm not good with children, so I couldn't handle you well. And I'm the one who caused you trouble. I never thought the day would come when I could have a conversation with my mother like this. At this stage in my life, I finally feel like I've come to understand my mother a bit. We've had many conversations since then, and we decided to use the money left by my father to fund the opening of her shop. Once she started working, she became somewhat humble. She was hesitant when the topic of funds for the shop came up, which would have been unimaginable not too long ago. While maintaining my regular job, I also helped with the opening of her diner, which led to me seeing my mother frequently. I attribute this newly forged relationship to my father. Regarding living expenses, she insisted on managing with her own income, not wanting to accept help from my father's inheritance. Promise me that you'll tell me if you're struggling. After all, Dad trusted me to take care of you. I'll be fine living on my own. It doesn't cost that much, but in terms of my diner's expenses, I'll be relying on you. Of course. I'm looking forward to it too, so do your best. After many years, we finally became a real family, and now we are living harmoniously. She is not my birth mother, and it might have just been the right time for me to learn this. Your diner's finally gonna open tomorrow. Your dream is coming true. Seeing you work so hard at that company reminded me of my own dreams when I was younger. I believe that's why I've made it this far. It's all thanks to you and your father. Thank you so much. Mom, promise me to always be my mom. Amy. From now on, let's get along even better than before. After all, we only have each other. That's true. Upon my father's death, the truth was revealed. I accepted the reality and decided to live on with just my mother and I. As I observed my mother's lifestyle, I thought about moving back to my hometown and living together with her again. I don't cook, so my mother is concerned of my poor diet and is supportive of me coming back. My father would probably be surprised that we're getting along so well. His house, company, and inheritance that he left behind. I'll protect them at all cost while continuing to get along with my mother. In order to become a real family, we visited the graves of my father and my biological mother, my mother's older sister, to give our daily life updates. After going through the process of adoption, I finally became registered as the daughter of my mother.